Hello and welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and today we have a throwback to a previous episode, trilogy of episodes that we covered. So if you've been following us since kind of the beginning, you might be familiar with our words matter, swear words really matter, and it's not the words that matter the most episodes. And in each of those, we were talking about communication, whether that's the verbal communication, the way that expletive and cursing can impact that communication, and really also how we can leverage body language and paraverbal communication to really get our message across clearly in mental health settings. We wanted to take these 3 episodes and condense them down into one and wanting to make it easy to access. So with that, we hope you enjoy this practice and action remix. Words, words, words.
Oh, here we are after all these conversations. We're in our new studio space, and all of a sudden now we're having a conversation with microphones in front of us for others to listen.
It's exciting. We've been having just so many back and forths, and to really just be here, I'm watching the recordings go. I guess it's a good feeling. It feels like we're really taking off and starting something. Yeah. And speaking of starting it, I want to start us off. We're talking about words today.
Right. Like such a simple topic, right? Words matter. So we've had this kind of conversation. And the reason I think it's important to talk about is, really the words that we use really have an impact on others and on other aspects of our life. We thought about this topic from, a situation where I was doing supervision with a clinician. And as we were talking about some of the content of her conversations, I was giving her some ideas to think and be more intentional in her words. And during that supervision, I said, remember, words matter.
It's a great title too.
It's a great title. So a little history on that title for me. So, I'm always interested in words, but when it comes to kind of thinking intentionally about words, this kind of goes back to my doctoral work. When I did my doctoral work, my first year as a doc student, we used to do something called standardized patients, where all the doc students would see a patient with similar difficulties. They were actors. And then we would get recorded and get feedback from professors. And kind of a shout out to Dr. Bruce Zahn at PCOM. He was the first professor I had interaction with this. And it was really a simple exchange. When I started my session, I used the phrase something like, "What brought you in to see me today?" And I get those words out, and Dr. Zahn pauses the tape and looks at me and goes, "Wow, is that really what you wanted to ask?" And I said, well, yeah. And he said, he's like, well, what brought them to therapy was probably a car. And he's like, isn't it what you wanted to ask was why they were there to see you? And he used that in that conversation, used the terms, remember, your words matter. And I've kind of held on to that. And I've since then become very intentional in my words and paying attention to what I say, when I say, and what reaction I'm going to get from it. So I'm excited that we're kind of talking about this.
Yeah. And, speaking of these conversations, you and I were talking, you had shared this story, and, we threw it out there as an idea, and it really made me stop and say, okay, why do I think words matter? And I really felt a connection to that topic. And yet on the surface, I didn't really know why. So I spent a bit of time thinking back, and I can just remember growing up. I feel like I was a bit conflict averse, still am, gotten much better with it. But the words I would use could help take me out of conflict within situations. And it wasn't trying to necessarily be avoidant of those conflicts, but rather working to resolve them in a way that I didn't have to sit there in that discomfort for much longer. So I really worked to be intentional with the words that I used. And that was probably the first thought that came to mind after we were talking about this idea for words matter. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I guess, you used it in a way to kind of bring down conflict or emotions. And I think what's important is, the words we use, it really can take people in different directions. So you use them to resolve conflict, but I think there's times we use words to evoke conflict, right? Or to at least evoke emotions in people. And I think that's why it's important to really think about maybe what we say and even not only what words we say, but how we say those words.
And it really makes me think of just the most important relationships in my life and the significance that I always want to give my words with them, and also the ease where I lose sight of that. And I think that's where oftentimes I also get into the most trouble with those relationships, or there's the greatest kind of disconnects, is when I'm choosing my words poorly, or I'm not really putting that intention or specificity in there. And I think that's something, as you're talking about, not only the words we say or how we say them, it allows for connection.
Yeah, an observation, that I think I have is I think a lot of times we move to just letting words fly out of our mouth, right? We say things and they're very punctuated in how we say them, and sometimes even meaningless. And, maybe an easy example is, how often do we use something like, how are you?
Doing good. How are you?
Right. That's the response, right? It's, I'm fine. I'm good. But are people, right? Like, is that something that we're saying and it's more a greeting than it really is a communication, and how do we change that? Like, is it different if I say, Paul, great to see you. How have you been? Does that change it versus this reflexive kind of, how are you? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, it felt different. Yeah.
It felt different, right?
Yeah, it did. And I think you're absolutely right. If we can put intention behind our words, I think that's when they carry the most meaning. And that it's a redundant sentence, but I think it still holds true, that if we are able to hold our words with care and choose them with purpose, that we can help to evoke the actions or reactions that we're hoping to, but carelessness kind of leads us up to mistakes or to areas that we weren't expecting, and then we have to scramble to make it work.
Or we just get a reaction or a comment from other people that is just as meaningless as what ours was. I remember reading this, this idea of, like, when we talk about things like, how are you? Like, when maybe people just say something like, I can't complain. And, and I remember reading people saying, well, that's really two different meanings, right? Like, I can't complain because I just can't get myself to complain. Or maybe it's, I can't complain because no one's going to listen anyhow. And I think that you're right. Like, I think just having that purpose and that intention, not only is it important to elicit that information, but it does build that connection.
Yeah. And I think connection's the word there. We see clients, we talk to them at least 4 or 5 days out of the week, and we need our words to connect with them. I can even think back to when I was, just first starting out as an outpatient therapist, and my clinical director was just kind of teaching me the ropes. And one of the things that he shared with me is, hey, have a routine, have a way that you start your session and you end your session. So that way it lets them know when is the time to focus and really go there emotionally. And when is it time to start wrapping things up and pulling back? And for me, just about every session I start off with, it's, hey, how have things been going for you since we last talked?
So that's really different, right? Like, I mean, just, as we said, kind of just how do we reword things? I've made the mistake with patients where they sit down and I just reflexively say, how are you? Or how are you doing?
Yeah.
But I like that. Like, how have you been since our last session? How do people take to that?
I think it varies. There are, some who call me out on it for using it every single time. And for those, I'll give some variance, or I purposely say it to try to get a reaction. But I think, again, it speaks to the connection that we have. For some, asking that question in that specific moment of how are you, it might be a great moment for them. And that's wonderful. But if it's one great moment out of a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks since we've last seen each other, sounds like there's other things that we're wanting to focus on. So I feel like it gives them an opportunity to fill in the gaps for me and to really kind of share if there's any really significant or meaningful experiences that are going to add, to the topics that we've been talking about, or that are going to be the new topic that we are talking about, rather than forcing the conversation to stick in an area that they might not be able to focus on.
When I hear you say it, I think there's a couple points to how you start those sessions. And I do something really similar in that way. But one, your words indicate transition. So, right, we walk people back. We might have some banter about how the weather is, and doing anything fun this week. But that transition, or those words, give a transition to say, okay, now we're going to get to the work. And I think that's important, is I think when we say, how have you been since last time I saw you? There's a caring there, right? Our choice of words brings people in. It becomes personal. And I know it sounds like a real simple thing, right? Like it's just very simple word changes, but that simplicity brings different meaning. I think it's important, and whether it's therapy or whether it's our family member that we haven't seen in a while, it's the same kind of connection. I think that's great.
And talking about like greetings, and pulling back to just a minute ago, that idea of, how you doing? That's an elongated greeting, but my greeting is intended to be that transition into more meaningful conversation, ideally. And we're not talking about the weather. We're not talking about sports. We're not talking about, the latest TikTok trend or whatever that is.
Right.
But, we're getting down into meaning. I like that. And that really didn't connect until just now.
So we're talking about those intros, but I guess, Paul, what are your thoughts on our goodbyes? How do we close those sessions, whether it's, again, professionally or personally? What language do you use?
I again, really like to keep it consistent as often as I can, where just letting them know that we're going to be transitioning out, and whether we're having an opportunity to sit down and scheduling, or we're just transitioning and it is a time for a goodbye, but calling that out. So some of that language is either, hey, we're soon getting to our time. This might be the last few thoughts, or we're going to be wrapping things up here soon. So trying to give them that warning, ideally, so that way they can start processing and pulling back and preparing, because some of the things we talk about are heavy. And for some, that cue sometimes I need that cue. So that way I'm also recognizing that I'm needing to not keep digging, and I need to be able to let this go until the next time we're able to talk. And then that intro can be the starting point again for next time.
So there's that consistency, and I'm probably on my endings maybe not as consistent as you are, in that it really depends on patients for me. It's this very structured closing every time. I do try to really think about how I'm ending. We're really in special job. I think sometimes it's, this idea of the trust that people put into us to share. And I often try to end with something on a note of, how much I really appreciate their willingness to be there with me and to trust me with that information. And then using that information on kind of closing and maybe a little preparation for that next session. Is there something we didn't cover today that you might want to cover next time?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it really, that structure, it's helpful.
And I think it's also important to be able to break that structure too.
Yeah.
There are times in which we're knee deep in it and we're not going to find a resolution, in the hour. And so needing to end things while things are still really heavy. And for me, if I just use that structured, routine ending, that doesn't quite do it. That doesn't feel genuine, because someone is sitting there in tears, or we just shared a really somber moment. And I do need to be mindful of the time. And it's probably one of the most frustrating parts of the job, is not being able to find a resolution within that time for me. And yeah, you have to. And again, speaking of words, to give that moment a name and to talk about that, and being able to then, I think, also help to recapture and bring us back to that moment. But oftentimes that acknowledgement is the transition that, we're able to step out, and stepping out with a bit of grace.
Yeah, I think kind of circling back, we started talking about these quick, superficial greetings, and now we're talking about more of a structured ending. I think our goodbyes, we have to watch those not only professionally, but even, personally. And I have a teenage daughter who I hear her all the time with her friends where they were doing something, and as they leave, it's love you, love you, love you. And, and I do that. I mean, I do that with people as well. And it becomes somewhat of a goodbye. And over time, I've really kind of thought about even something like love you and how that maybe is different than words that we use to evoke emotion. And I've really become purposeful with those who are meaningful in my life, where when I want to express my emotion to them, being intentional and using, just adding the I to love you and saying, I love you, and how that's different and how that feels different when I say it, but even different when that person hears it. So we're talking about beginnings and endings, but I guess maybe what's the middle, right? So, in therapy, there's the old quote of, in therapy, you want to strike while the emotions are hot. And how do we evoke that emotion in others? For my daughters or my wife, I'm adding that I to I love you to try to really give that emotion and have them feel that emotion. But I guess, what's your thoughts on how we do that with patients? How do we use our words to create an emotional response in therapy to help promote the progress that we're making?
It's funny that today's the day that we're recording this episode, because I had an experience where I'm sitting down and I'm talking with a client and his mother, and his mom she's upset, and she was sharing how just here recently her son had said that he hated her. And he qualified that. He chimed in, he said, I hate you sometimes. And so then mom was kind of a bit pensive there. And then just him and I then took over. And, after doing an initial check-in with him, I was like, so do you hate your mom? And he's like, yeah, no, I do hate her sometimes. And I was like, what does hate mean for you? And trying to really kind of gauge that idea of, naming for him what that meaning is. And he said, I dislike her. Like, oh, okay. So went over to our whiteboard and drew a scale 1 to 10. And I was like, where's hate at on the scale? Where, if 10 is the strongest negative emotion you can feel, and 1 is a slight negative emotion. And he said it was a 5. I was like, okay, where do you put dislike? He said it was a 4. I was like, okay, my scale looks different. Given your mom's reaction, I think her scale is different. And, I asked him if he would be okay with it from when his mom does come back in, hey, let's have her, add to her scale. And so, we're going through and we're talking about that meaning for him. And mom comes in and we're chatting, and I'm like, hey, this is what we were talking about. Before I tell you what you're looking at in this whiteboard, 1 to 10, what is hate for you? And she says it's a 9. And so, he and I were kind of shared a glance there, and I was sharing with her how, when he's saying it, at least in the way that he had described it in that moment, it was a 5, and probably even closer to a 4, given the context that he was sharing. And mom seemed relieved. She didn't seem super happy that, that her son's still saying that he hates her. But I think mom is able to hear that, hate means dislike. And it's much easier to hear, I dislike you rather than I hate you.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of not only are we talking about like the words that we're using, but really making sure that people have the same meaning of the words, right? Yeah. We want to make that assumption, but for me, hate would be a really strong, like when you said that, I was like, wow, okay, that's for me probably on the top of my list, probably be a 10 for me. So it's interesting that, I guess maybe that's a great lesson in the sense that when we're using words, we really do need to make sure that people are receiving them the same way. And because that really could change the context. I think that's interesting. So that's the vocabulary piece. I guess, what do you think as far as like when I used that quote, we strike while the emotions are hot. How do we use language to have people feel emotions? Like, have you thought about that?
And I think probably in the future, we're going to be doing an episode on this, but I think it comes from how well we listen. And, in hearing what it is that they're sharing, or even just, that overall their story, and being able to capture the emotion in the language we use in the right moment. And it's kind of like an art in a way.
Right.
And, to hold homage to striking while the emotions are hot, because if we lose it and it cools off, I think it loses a lot of meaning. It loses a lot of value. And so if we can really work to capture how we are experiencing that and putting it into words, and again, and ensuring that we have that same understanding of the words that we're using, that it can really be a way for people to feel heard and validated, as well as being able to maybe feel challenged. And I'm wondering, Ray, as you're kind of sharing this, how do you elicit the emotions that you're wanting? And how do you, from maybe identifying this is the direction we need to go, really bring that to life?
Yeah, I think, for me, I really believe that therapy has to be this emotional experience. And I often will, for individuals, let's just use depression, preparing them that, some of the things we're going to talk about are really going to be some of the words that they've used, or maybe that they've kind of thoughts that they've shared, and using those words back to elicit that emotion. And so, you mentioned listening, and I think that's absolutely important. And I think we have to be careful. Sometimes using their own words might elicit maybe too strong of a reaction. But a lot of times I'll do that. I might pick a word that is something that they say that reflects a thought. So yeah, I think listening is part of it. And I think being comfortable with it, that if we're saying, so you talked about the example about hate. I've had patients where I've said, wow, when you say that, it sounds like you hate yourself. And that's an eye-opening experience, right? Like, so their reaction is strong. I said it because I want the reaction. So I think that's an example where it's maybe picking a word that's hard to say to someone, to say, wow, my perception when you say this is what it sounds like. But for them, I'm just thinking of a person I had worked with not too long ago. And when I said that back to them, it was a very emotional experience. And, the individual said, yes, I do. And it's hard every day to think that and to feel that. That would have been different if I said, wow, it sounds like you dislike yourself.
Right.
That different impact there. A different impact. And so I think we always have to be cautious, but it's a good way to help move people. That was a wonderful session for that person, not wonderful to experience, but wonderful in change, because it was the first time she heard someone else say it. And I think that's what we have to do in therapy. I think that it's getting people to that point. And then how do we use that same concept of selecting the right words to change it? So we couldn't stay in that idea of hate. And, the CBT person I am, jumping right into, so wow, if I say that over and over to myself, that's hard. That's going to make you feel down. How can we change your own words? What are some other words we might be able to use? And having that discussion, it's not magic. We're not going to change it right in the moment, but we got to an emotion and we helped move that emotion slightly in a different direction. So when I think about words in therapy and how I use words to evoke emotions, that's a simple example.
Yeah. And when you are sharing that, using someone's words back to them, and especially if they're words that they don't hear others use back to them, or they use platitudes instead, and how powerful that can be. It also reminds me of how important it can be to name the words that someone's avoiding, or name the thing that we're dancing around, in session, and being able to say that hard thing. And I think as a therapist, I really care about the people I talk with.
Right.
And it can be hard to say some of these things to them. And yet it's being able to share those words and the connection that those words mean that can help promote the growth.
And I think, and this is going to come in, I think, future episodes as well. When's the right time to use those words? And I think, we have to know, when do we have that relationship with people, and I make jokes with my patients that I see. I'm really not a warm and fuzzy guy. So sometimes I'm going to be direct, and I kind of prep them for that. And most people, I think, appreciate that. That might not be the right fit for everyone, though. There are some times that I am that warm and fuzzy guy because we have to approach things differently. So I think while we're talking about selecting words, I think when it comes to therapy, part of our word selection is also knowing the patient. And what I'm going to say to a teenager is going to be different than a child versus, an adult.
Yeah. And as you're talking about how that became a really powerful session for you, Ray, I'm reminded of a different situation where I intentionally chose some words that I knew would be hurtful and letting them sit and letting them simmer. And the context of it was we were talking through some hurtful things that had happened for her in her past, and she was torn whether she should reach out or not. And in hearing, the words that she was choosing and the way she was saying it, and she didn't want to reach out, but she was waiting for someone to tell her that she didn't have to reach out. And so I told her she should reach out. And the sullen, downtrodden look. And I didn't let it last too long, but I was able to kind of share like, hey, you let me dictate what you were going to do right there. And so the words I chose right there, I saw the impact they had on you, and I chose them very intentionally. And her and I had that relationship. I felt comfortable with being able to do that and coming back from it and being able to qualify that, hey, I heard, you didn't want to reply at all, but you're waiting for someone to tell you that. But you already knew the answer. I gave you the answer you didn't want, and you knew it. And so, we then took that point to say, you knew this answer. Let's not rely on this, the validations or the dismissiveness of someone else for her to make those decisions. But in that sense, the words I used had a very specific intention there. And again, a different way that I feel like it became a very productive session for us.
Right.
But in a different way that wasn't necessarily naming the words back, but saying the things that she was afraid of hearing.
Right. I mean, I think maybe the idea of this episode is words matter, but I think maybe what we're really kind of talking about is not only the words we choose matter, but how do we use them with intention? And whether we're helping to get someone emotional or helping someone realize maybe they need to hear certain things, but also using those same words to build people up, what we choose and how we choose them and the intentions that we're trying to get. It's just something we need to be really attuned to, and we really have to kind of pay attention and not being superficial or punctuating what we're saying, really selecting words and using them to make progress for people.
And words matter is the theme that we were talking about, but I feel like there's that subtext that says the connection that they bring. And, it's so important that we as clinicians, as we're using them, that we're saying them with a specific intent, but we also have to ensure that they're being interpreted with that specific intention, because they do have the power to hurt. And, for us, I feel like our purpose is to promote change and promote growth, for those that we serve. One of the most crucial ways that we need to recognize that is with our words. Words matter.
They do, Paul. I agree. And I'm glad we had this opportunity to just an introduction to the idea of words. And I think for our listeners, we're going to maybe take this in some other directions and talk further about words in some future episodes. But I appreciate the start.
It was a good start. Yeah.
It's a good start.
With that, we hope this episode got you psyched, and we want to thank you all for listening.
Hey everyone, we are here today with no guests, and Paul and I are doing a duo session bridging off of the Words Matter episode. And today we're going to talk about, and today we're going to talk about swearing. So Paul, we talked about words matter. I'm going to say, for me, sometimes swear words really matter.
They do. And I think in a lot of ways, if we swear not in our sessions, they can kind of make or break a session that I found.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the idea of swearing in psychotherapy is not new, right? So, you think back, for me, it was Albert Ellis. I mean, I remember the first time I ever heard his tapes and I went, oh, wow, this is not Carl Rogers, right?
No, it is not.
Right. So, in some ways he became, well known for the fact that he swore. And I think sometimes people see that as a benefit in therapy. And I think sometimes maybe that can be something that turns people off.
I think if it's something that's done well, it can really form a pretty strong bond between at least me and the clients that I see that I choose to curse with. But if I do it improperly or a bit too much or at the wrong moments, I can definitely feel the divide. So it's something that personally I think is done sparingly, but really trying to choose the right moments.
I remember kind of think back, I mentioned Ellis, and I was lucky kind of early in to actually do some training with him. That made me really think about it was, he was known for swearing, like I said, but it wasn't that he was trying to force it in therapy. It was, he just talked that way. It wasn't something that when he was getting videoed, he was doing. It was just how he talked. So when he used it in therapy, in some ways it was natural. And, I start off saying, I think, swear words sometimes really matter. I don't always have the cleanest vocabulary, but for me, it's part of how I talk. And I, in therapy, stay kind of true to who I am. Now, I do think it depends on who the client is. I think there's other variables, but when we try to force it to be cool or we try to force it to get a reaction, I think that's when it comes across wrong. If it's part of just that human connection, I think it can be actually pretty powerful.
I think a gauge for me is if we weren't in the therapy session and I were talking with this person, is this a person that I would curse with? Because I think there's a determining factor there where if I'm working with kids, I'm not going to curse. If I have an older teen, I could see myself. And that just happening also very naturally, where being able to relate and connect in a way that isn't me saying, oh, darn, it's like, damn, that was heavy. And I think there's an appreciation when you're able to go there versus the kind of PG versions that sometimes I think are pressured in a way, especially in my education. There weren't too many professors that I had that would curse. They would be very mindful and intentional. And a lot of ways I modeled my therapeutic language based off of them. And when I would have a professor that would curse and curse well, I liked that professor. It felt like, even though I was in a class with many, it felt connective.
Cursing well is a great concept, right?
Yeah.
I like that term. I think I curse well sometimes. The other piece of it is, I do agree. I think, with kids, of course, that's really off limits. Teens, it gets to be a little bit of a gray area sometimes. But I also think if a teen comes in and uses certain language, there can be a connection made by reflecting that back, which is important. I think there's a lot of therapists that just, they don't feel comfortable with it. And I don't think they should try to be. But for me, what I've kind of found in therapy is swearing's how people think, right? I heard this example somewhere, and I don't remember who did it, but they were talking about if you're going for a walk and you're walking down the street and you're not paying attention, and the person walking in front of you, their dog went to the bathroom and you didn't pay attention and you stepped in it. What's your thought?
Shit.
Right. It's not, oh, wow, my shoes messed up. And I think that's our automatic thought, right? Our thought comes out as shit or damn it or whatever it might be. And we have to sometimes to get to the emotion that's tied to a situation. That's where the use of swearing can be powerful and not offensive.
Yeah, you read my mind, that idea of what it evokes in the moment and how if it can be paired to mirror that moment well, there's a limited number of words that really go there, and we call them curse words because they go there. And so if we can find the pairing, it really hits it home. But if not, man, does it feel disconnecting? And in some ways, it's kind of that opposing of when there's a moment when you should say shit and then you're saying darn in session, that creates a bit of a barrier at times.
It does. So I guess, like, how do we know when it's the right time, or if it is the right time with a client or a patient? Like, how do we make that decision without it becoming offensive?
One of my personal compasses with that is if it's being used in the session, and also if I'm comfortable with the way that it's being used in a session. If it's being used very aggressively and hatefully sometimes,
right,
I don't want to go there with them with that. I can hear it and I can mirror that back in different ways, but I don't know that that's the most effective usage of me cursing, but rather if it connects that moment of hurt or shock or anger in a way that feels descriptive, but maybe not necessarily hateful. I think that's when I start to think, okay, this is a moment. And sometimes I capture that moment. And other times, and I question myself when I'm doing this, I'll preface it. And I've only done this a few different times, but I always find myself questioning why I did it afterwards of, yeah, pardon my language. Damn. Right. And I think I get mixed reviews. I think sometimes people are like, you don't need the pardon my language. And for others, it's like, okay, I appreciate the heads up. And I can go there because you did that. So what are your thoughts on that idea of prefacing it?
Yeah, no, I do the same thing sometimes. I mean, there's some people I can just read, I just like, it's pretty easy. They come in and either just the way they've already spoken during the session, or there's enough, for lack of a better word, tells that they give me that I go, wow, that's fucked up. They don't get shocked by that. That's not, because that's what they were thinking anyhow. Right. So I think that's okay. There are other people I just don't know. And I would be much more cautious in what I would say. And so I think it's just a matter of, sometimes prefacing it, sometimes really knowing your clients, what's the language they're using.
Yeah.
And then I think your comfort using it back. I don't mind using it back if it really hits a point. But I wouldn't drop words like that if there wasn't a therapeutic purpose.
Yeah. I'm curious what your thoughts are. If there's an established relationship there that doesn't use cursing, whether it's an individual or a couple that's used cursing on and off within the session, do you go there after there's an established relationship, or does it feel like it would almost create a bit of a divide?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think that it really depends on that person. And I do think we have to be cautious of the divide it can create. I remember a patient I had years ago who had a therapist who, and this is a teenage patient, so put that in perspective, that had a therapist that was using curse words too often. And his perception as a teen was, I don't think he's very intelligent. It came across the wrong way.
Yeah.
And so, even though this is a kid who used them in session, it was somebody who used it, I think he wasn't ready for that coming back. So I think it just depends on the actual patient. I think sometimes I would go there and sometimes I wouldn't. And there are patients that I see that would never hear me curse because I know it's not the right thing. And there are some that it has very good value to.
And actually more recently, I think I found myself in some situations where I've had some of those established relationships with clients. And for some, they'll call me out on it. And whether it's kind of a joke or it's like a tense moment and I'll say something and they use it as a moment of levity to say, we broke you, or, we finally wore you down. And it can be like just kind of a calm moment in between the session, and other moments where maybe it just never really felt like the right time. And then it was the right time. And right. There's maybe been months or even close to a year of a connection. And this is that first time. And man, the feeling of relief, or just the acknowledgement and all the nonverbals that are given of like, yes, mm-hmm. that is that, that's fucked up.
Right.
And wow, did they connect with that in a way that any other phrasing wouldn't have had that impact?
Yeah. This is going to maybe sound complex. I mean, we're talking about swearing, which is this very visceral automatic response. but not as a therapist. For me, there truly is purpose. And I only swear in session when it benefits the patient, if that makes any sense. Like it's, where I kind of go, okay, this is either going to connect me with them, or this is the reflection they need back, or I know it's what's going through their head. We just got to call it out. So it is purposeful, it is. And I think the mistakes people make is sometimes it's not the same swearing I do with my friends, which can get out of control. And this is very controlled and purposeful. But yeah, sometimes it's the right time. And it's interesting. I had someone just not too long ago who, in the first time in the session, I said a swear word that would not have been typical for me, and you could just see the reaction. Like I think what you said, it was almost a relief. Like they were like, "Oh, yeah, this was good. Now it's out in the open." And then they reflected the word right back to me and went, "Yes, this is how I feel." So yeah, I do think we have to be purposeful, though. I think that's an important part of this whole conversation is swearing for the sake of just throwing words out doesn't matter. Swearing for a therapeutic benefit can be helpful.
I think so often when I first hear clients cursing in the session and their look of shock or their look, "Oh, I'm so sorry," of censoring themselves, and being able to foster that relationship in the session that says, "Hey, we can be ourselves." And, if you want to just kind of let it fly and talk about how angry and frustrating you were using all the expletives under the sun, go for it. I'm here to hear that, but I'm also here to work with it as well. But when they start to do that and then they hold back,
sure.
I think really trying to give that permission and say, "Hey, this space is your space. We can go there as long as it feels comfortable for you." And I think that's even going back to the idea of language. That's some of the language that I'll use to try to foster that connective feeling that says, "Hey, this can be whatever you want it to be."
The CBT person that I am, I almost frame it for people is it's more helpful for me to really know what you say to yourself. Like, don't filter it because I'm going to be offended. Like, if that's how you say it in your mind, that's important, because I do think, saying darn versus shit does have a difference. And so we can frame it, I think, a whole lot of ways, and giving them permission, I think, is important. I guess a thought I had was, so when is the time that we tell a patient that their swearing goes too far? Like when do we, do you ever stop them? Like, is there a time where you go, "All right, this isn't appropriate for my session"?
I referenced it a little earlier, but I think when it starts to feel like a negative feedback loop, and where it's creating resistance to change or growth rather than promoting it, I really look out for that. And I also look out, like, there's specific contexts where I've had 5-year-olds sitting in the room, and the parents are distraught because they're about to go into school, and their child is dropping. Again, it's shit, fuck, asshole. Right. And they're so worried about that, and being able to establish, "Hey, okay, this is not appropriate. This is not okay." Because one, there's an authority figure here who's saying that it's not okay. And also there's going to be consequences and ramifications. And I try to connect it a lot of times with that of, how do we work with this system, and what system are we in? And so if it's school, if it's with parents, or in a household where, like, "Hey, this really isn't okay," trying to model that in a way that doesn't feel shaming or judgmental, but rather connected with, why am I saying this? And can you connect with why I'm drawing attention to this in this moment? The 5-year-old sometimes has a hard time hearing that, but being able to hear that, "Hey, that makes me feel uncomfortable." I can imagine that makes, your friends feel uncomfortable sometimes. Okay. That might get a pause. That might also reinforce the behavior a little bit if it's attention seeking, but it's being able to work to set some of those boundaries. But I think if it feels like it's no longer promoting change, that's when I try to limit it some.
Yeah, I like your term when the phrase you said about being in a loop. I think that's what I look for. swearing for a cathartic effect, I don't think is helpful. Like, I think that it's just to throw out words or to name call, or whether it's their significant other or somebody at work. I usually kind of draw a line there. Like, for me, it's like, swearing to express our own emotions is one thing. Swearing to offend somebody is different for me. And so I sometimes will call people out on that. Maybe not the first time. Like, I've had people say, oh, that person's an ass or whatever. Okay, I'm probably not going to go there. But if it goes into that loop, I think it's important that we go, wow, like, listen for a second. Like, when you're in that loop and you're saying this person's a that and a this and a, like, you can watch their negative emotion kind of build. And so I stop that. And I think also if it's hateful, like, to whatever, like, I don't allow racial words. I don't like, there's a limit with what I say, like that's not how I talk. And that we can't have that as part of our session. But other than that, I mean, I as long as it's personal to them, I can sometimes let it go pretty far.
Yeah. And I think there might be times when you're referencing that hateful language towards, I will say aggressive language towards others. Hateful is I think I try to draw a different line there, but aggressive language towards others, I think I let go a little further, because then I think we have more ground to look back on, and being able to kind of say, like, hey, like, you've just spent the last 5 minutes saying this about this person, yet I know that you care for this person because you've talked about them, or I know that you have to interact with this person. And so does 5 minutes of negativity is that really the most helpful, or can we do something to change that viewpoint? And so I think letting it go gives it a bit of traction, but I definitely, it won't be something that I let go too far. But I think having a bit of wiggle room there for myself, I can see some benefit or use in that.
So we're going to dig into real semantics and detail. So do you ever get people that say, like, let's say they're calling somebody and they say, oh, she's a bitch, versus do you ever qualify and say, listen, let's not label the person. Let's say they're acting bitchy or something like that. I don't know. Do you see a difference in that? And do you see a value in that therapeutically?
I think I more so question what the identifying label is for them, and being able to say, okay, like, what makes her a bitch? What about whether the situation? And so being able to then start naming the other pieces or the specifics of that, and letting that be separate from the person themselves. So I think I go about that just in a different way, using more of the label rather than trying to reframe it as a descriptor in a sense.
Okay. So we'll put another twist on this. What's your thoughts on when parents use it in front of their kids, where it can be maybe too far? So I'm telling you, I do like to swear, but not until my kids got older were they maybe quite aware of that. As they've gotten older, I'm sure, that they're definitely more aware of that. But how do you approach that with a parent where, you gave the example of a 5-year-old, which I've had those cases myself. How do we talk to the parents about that? How do you do it?
I think it's easiest to connect if they're concerned about the children using the language, and it then becomes, I think, a really productive conversation in talking about modeling, and being able to really reinforce what we want, the communication that we want, and recognizing where that's coming from. But if they don't care about it, but it's creating distress or it's creating complications, or even if at times it's making me uncomfortable, certainly not trying to be self-serving, but using that as a tool to reflect that back of like, hey, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable right now. Can you see how maybe your child is could feel uncomfortable, or hearing, you both call each other this, or hearing just how harsh that can feel. This is what it feels like to me. I don't necessarily know that that's always the intention behind it, because it can feel so normalized. And so drawing attention to it in some of those ways. I think I usually don't go there when I first hear it, though. It needs to be something like almost a recurrent pattern that I'm hearing, or something that is building over time, because I don't necessarily know what what the dynamics or the expectations are. And if it is used, and I don't necessarily know the appropriate way to use cursing around younger children, but if it's used in a way that fits those moments and situations, and I happen to just be witnessing that moment, I don't want to jump in and invalidate those experiences for them. But if I'm seeing a recurrent pattern where it's being used a bit flippantly, then that's when I find myself wanting to step in and interject a bit.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm kind of in the same thing. I mean, I use the word modeling. I think I say that often. And, I often will tell parents, like, you almost have to go the full opposite, where you have to show really good new language. People let words slip. That happens. But, if you have a child doing that, I think maybe that's a little different. One of the other things that we're talking about, kind of came to my mind, is I've actually had times where I've, for lack of a better word, prescribed swearing, where I've said, like, listen, you need to use an intense language to evoke an emotion, to almost charge you up. There's interesting. There's a great TV show. If somebody wants to really be into swearing, Nicolas Cage hosts a show on Netflix called The History of Swear Words. They talk actually on that show about research that shows if you swear, you can tolerate pain better, like physical pain, like they do. And they do all these great experiments on the show. But there's really research to show that. And I've had patients, specifically patients who have some emotional turmoil and they're having a hard time dealing with the negative emotions, to say, like, listen, like, I don't want you to say, oh, I don't want to be sad. I want you to go, shit, I hate being sad. Like, that's different. Like that swear word almost can bring a little bit of an intensity to help pull them in a direction.
And to mirror, and I think it was one of my takeaways previously of that idea of striking while the emotion is hot. We need the emotion to be hot to be able to forge the change.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we can see that in other aspects of life. I've seen musicians do it, athletes do it, where they're using language that pumps them up. I always love when they hot mic football players, right? There's more sensor beeps in those tapes than there are words sometimes. They're not using it in any other way than to create energy. And I think when our emotions are down, we can't be afraid to help patients create energy. It's interesting. I have a patient, an older patient that I see, who I actually said, listen, like, it's going to sound weird, like we're going to do an intervention that I want you to swear when you're trying to get yourself out of your depressive thoughts. Like, I don't want you to whisper to them. The intensity of your thoughts are almost bullying. And I want you to talk with that same intensity back. And it was great because he was like, I can't even think what word we ended up choosing. It may have been like damn or something like that. But what was great was he came back and he went, wow, that made a difference. Like, he's like that. He said, it almost was like, it gave me I was angry at my depression instead of letting the depression pull me down. He's like, I got angry. And I went, no, like, I'm not going to think this way today. So I think we can use them therapeutically, not only just in our conversations, but letting people know that it's okay to have that in their mind to help evoke some of those emotions, to help make some progress.
I think that evoking or evocative, that word has been on my mind since we started, because that's really what curse words are, that they're there to evoke. And if we as therapists, psychologists, anyone who's in the mental health field that's looking to promote a change can tap into some of that evocative language, we can really, really do some good.
I agree. And I think some of the things, we mentioned, do it if it's only true to you. Like, I think we have to keep that. And I think doing it at the right time and knowing our patients. But yeah, that I think is the key message. Our goal in therapy is to evoke and help people control emotions.
Just one more tool to do that well.
That's right. So, Paul, this was kind of fun, kind of an interesting episode.
What a different take and spin on our previous duo episode, but I think an important follow-up.
With that, I think it's time to get the hell out of here, right?
Yeah. We'll see you next week. Be well and stay psyched.
So Paul, we're back in the studio again to do another duo episode together. So, excited to have some time to continue our conversation.
And, I think we're really hoping to round out this first kind of, I guess, maybe trilogy of duo episodes, and really wanting to talk about all the things that aren't words, but are so important in communication. And so focusing in on like the nonverbals and paraverbals and how in a lot of ways it's not the words that matter the most.
Yeah. We've all heard kind of these like statistics, right? Like 80% of what we understand in communication comes from nonverbals or from body language. I don't know if that number is accurate. I'm not sure if they can measure that, but I think it's enough to say though that, these other variables are also very important in how we communicate.
And, whether it's in a personal sense or professional sense, I think it really plays such a significant role to make sure that, what we're saying is being connected with in the way that we intend it.
We've talked about being interested in words, but I think I've probably been as interested in the idea of body language just as much. I think we're all people watchers, right? We kind of watch how people interact and what they do and try to interpret that. And, for me, I've even gone as far as, there's great books, great research that's out there. I read just not that long ago a book by Joe Navarro, who's a former FBI agent who writes books on what different body language means. So this is an interesting topic for me.
Definitely not to the level maybe of an FBI agent in terms of scrutiny, but we have to learn not only to be very mindful of our body language, but also being able to read body language as well. If we're going to be effective clinicians, and how important that is. And, because body language and paraverbals, they're pervasive, it's not just in the therapy setting. I think we can almost most naturally notice this in our personal lives. Yeah. And as we're talking about this topic, just a recent event comes to mind where my fiance and we were walking across the street, and she did something with her hands where she just kind of made a small hand gesture, and she stopped herself and she said, I'm doing the thing that you do. And now like that caught me by surprise. I'm like, oh, what are you talking about? She's like, well, when you get excited, you talk with your hands and you do this gesture when you're trying to think of something or when you're trying to convey something. And I had no idea. And now as time has gone on, as I'm seeing her do this more, I'm recognizing she's excited and and this is like a bit of mimicking there. But it's something that I didn't recognize that I do myself that she really heavily recognized and then caught herself doing. So, it's there in our personal lives. It's there just about in every form of communication we can have.
Yeah. I think that awareness, I think is interesting. I think we're really good at recognizing body language in everyone else. You were talking about, your fiance. I think, I probably understand more from my teenage daughter from her body language than her words sometimes, both whether she's agreeing with me or not, there's that information. But I think, your example, I think is important because it also helps you kind of recognize to pay attention to your own body language, right? And to notice that in yourself. And maybe we're not as good at that.
I think it's, I think as a therapist, I like to think that, I have a level of mastery that I know I don't, I'm just scratching the surface of really. But her calling me out on that, it has brought just this increased awareness there. It doesn't mean that I'm doing it maybe necessarily any less, but recognizing when I'm doing it. And now I'm kind of cataloging like, okay, what does it mean when I'm doing this? Right. And, audience, you can't hear me right now, but I'm doing this body language of catalog. and so whether you can hear it or not, it's happening.
Right. There's a little charades going on as we talk. But yeah, it's interesting because you kind of, mentioning about being a clinician. I think as a clinician, and maybe we're more attuned in a therapy room with our body language. And maybe we don't give that same level of attention or respect to it outside of that. And I think, that us starting in the idea of just, how do we use this in our daily life with family and with friends, and how does that come across to other people? I'm sure I'm much more aware of my tone and am I making eye contact? How am I sitting when I have a patient who I want to make sure that they perceive a certain I guess message. I'm not sure I'm as good of that with my wife. Yes. and maybe that awareness is something we should really focus more of in just everyday relationships, because I do think it does impact it. It's just as far as making sure that the people we care about know that we're listening. Or in your example, I think the fact that you can recognize and go, wow, my fiance is excited about this. That's great. I think we need to do that more often.
And well, one, it's just now become a bit of an inside joke, and we can kind of tease each other about it. But it really does, it deepens that connection. And it says that, one, makes me feel like, oh, she cares enough to notice this about me. And I'm hoping that she knows that me noticing this about her is that in that same message, it's about care and it's about attending to her.
Yeah.
And I think, just as much as we can use our body language, or even paraverbals as, positive markers, I think that there's also some negatives that can come through, especially if we're not very intentional or we're not really recognizing body language. And so awareness, I think, is such an important piece here when we're talking about these topics.
Yeah, I think, you used the word intention, and I know that's been in a couple of other episodes that we have. I mean, I think that itself is kind of a recurring theme. And yeah, I mean, we do need to look at the intentional piece, but also understand that we do have some unconscious moments. Like there are times that we do things and we're just unaware, and that can happen with body language. But the more we can make it intentional, I think the better influence it has. I've been thinking as we were kind of talking about this topic, I think as in a personal sense, as a society, we've really started changing our body language just for the use of technology and how that impacts. I was, I said I'm a people watcher. I was sitting in a restaurant not that long ago, and a family sitting across from us. The one parent was having a conversation, and everybody else was on their cell phone, nodding their head and having the conversation. But what stuck out to me was from an outsider going, wow, their body language is really dismissive. And who knows what the words were. But as a person, I would have thought, man, in that situation, I would have felt that what I was saying didn't matter to who my audience would have been. So I think sometimes we even at that level, just simply those everyday things, like if somebody's talking to us, putting down our cell phone and making eye contact as a body language, clear up to the intentional part of what's the message we want. Do we want a firm message? Do we want to be more caring? I think there's a lot of directions this whole idea of body language goes.
In some ways, when we're looking at it like that, I love that idea with technology. And it makes me think, even in the therapy room, especially if I'm thinking of the intake process, and the intake, is always, I think that it's juggling, this gathering of information and trying to kind of be that, I need to be actively listening to all of the things that are being shared, but I also need to be recording it, and I need to make sure that I'm gathering the correct or specific information. And there are times, maybe if I'm sitting at my desk, where I might ask a question, and as they are responding, I'm typing. And I try to be very intentional initially to say, this is not going to be the norm. And I say, I hope this is the worst session we ever have, because I'm not going to be giving you, it's not going to feel like I'm giving you my full attention, because I'm having to then kind of go back and document, or making sure I'm keeping accurate records there. And I think me calling it out helps, But sure. I feel disconnected or disjointed to the point where when we next have our next session where, the paperwork piece is done and we can, connect. I'm like, hey, with this, we might recover these things. I want to go more in depth because I wasn't able to go as in depth in this moment. And so, body language there, ideally hoping that they're still feeling heard and seeing it as purposeful, but it could just be this person's talking to me while they're looking at their computer and typing. Yeah.
And I've heard that so much from patients, and even in my personal life from people who have said, healthcare's changed, right? Like we go to a physician's office and they bring in a laptop and they sit across from us and they're typing, and it's the documentation itself creates some nonverbals that I think people perceive as not caring. And so I think healthcare in general faces that. And when you said that, I'm thinking, I do that as well. I hope that, I do the same thing. I kind of ahead of time say, please know this is just to help me remember. And it's just an easier way for me to document. And this isn't the norm, and trying to at least provide maybe what the next step is going to be so that you don't feel dismissed. But so technology has affected our body language in itself.
Yeah, and it comes down to, I think, this idea of being intentional with it. And if we can create this, intention, or if we can share our intentions transparently, I think we can ensure that it's being interpreted in that way, or, as best we can as being unique individuals. But body language, even as a whole, I think in the professional sense, as a therapist, it's so important. And,
sure.
It's, as we've been kind of preparing for this episode, it's just kind of almost kind of a mountain of just different examples or thoughts of when body language went well, when it didn't, when paraverbals and tone of voice, went well. And on the other side of like recognizing that coming in from, when we're sitting down in the therapy session, hey, how is this being interpreted or received? Right. What are the communications coming back to me?
Yeah. And it's interesting as we're preparing for this, I do think that I'm pretty aware of body language. At least I hope I am, but bringing it to my awareness, really, it made me be much more introspective of little things that I did and really paying attention, saying like, what is my body language like? And, I'm lucky. I work with a variety of patients. I have from young kids to some who are retirees. And, I noticed that it changes. I had the other day, a 5-year-old come into my office who was nervous. Was with parents. I'm a big guy. I was likely intimidating. And when he walked in, I sat down on the floor, very different than I would do with anyone else. And it was interesting to watch his reaction. It was almost to some extent, almost a shock. And he reacted and then he sat on the floor, despite there was a couch and chairs and other things. But that little simple gesture of body language changed his perception. So I've been more aware. When I see people nervous, I notice I lean back more. I close my body up to seem maybe less intimidating. Or on the other hand, I want to make a point, and there are times that I lean forward and maybe broaden my body to almost have more of an assertiveness kind of approach. And that's necessary in the moment. So, I think this awareness and intention of it, it's really been fun over the last few weeks, just really kind of being attuned to it. How do we get attuned? And Ray, if you wouldn't mind, sharing your story from earlier about, the class that you were in and really kind of where they focused on how do you learn how to recognize body language, or what do you do with body language and paraverbals? Yeah, it was interesting. So this was a class, 20 plus years ago I had that, one of the things that we were talking about was, being aware of our reactions due to, in therapy, we're going to hear things that could, be surprising or, things that are sometimes hard to hear, or maybe we have to ask questions that are difficult to word. And, so it started out, and I'll never forget our first assignment was this list of questions and words. And we were supposed to go home and watch ourselves in the mirror as we read the questions, whether it be using words about body parts and, saying penis in the mirror and looking at yourself to asking a question about rape, where there's an emotional sensitivity to it and being able to kind of pay attention to what we do in our reaction. And then the second part of that class, we would sit with partners and they would just have a list of things that they would say in conversation and give us feedback on how we were reacting when we were hearing things. And I remember that because it honestly was a really powerful lesson for me. And in some ways it did help me that when I hear things, I am able in milliseconds being able to really attune to what my response is. If somebody's saying something that is maybe a trauma that they've had, if we have a facial expression that it's uncomfortable, they may not respond back to us. So, yeah, I think part of it is maybe practice. That sometimes with this, we have to, not only just look at ourselves and how we say things, but really pay attention to what's the reaction from it.
Having not only to kind of feel comfortable with talking about the uncomfortable things, but feel comfortable with the expression, like our physical expressions or tones when we're talking about the uncomfortable things. And, as you were sharing that before, the first thought that came to mind was just the kind of the bombshell moments in a session where, in the very beginning, hearing, that a loved one has suddenly passed away. Or, as you're saying, that uncovered trauma or, something where there's this significant disclosure, and being intentional with what is the message that I'm wanting to convey in this moment. And I don't have time to prepare, but where do I want to take this? And is it to be comforting? Is it to be empathetic and connective? Mm-hmm. Is it to feel, in the same way with empathy, is it to feel like, hey, this is not okay, and kind of matching that energy as well. Sure. And trying to connect that not only with the words that we use, but also with, very importantly, how we're presenting them and what we're accompanying those words with in terms of body language. It also kind of reminds me of talking about the uncomfortable taboo things. And when you're talking about, being able to say penis, talking with, young teenagers about porn. Right. And that's the topic that parents, kind of whisper, or they say like, they were looking up, inappropriate things on the internet. Right. And so then, I'm sitting down and I'm like, all right, so you're looking up porn, what's going, right. And they're being just in ease and flow with the conversation and trying not to make this a taboo topic, but rather, hey, this is, for this to be effective, we need to be able to communicate effectively about it. And so let's not kind of, do the song and dance around it. Let's talk about it frankly and plainly. And then I can answer questions, I can work to connect things, and I can work to be as supportive as possible to them.
Yeah. And I think along that line, maybe part of this awareness is also paying attention to our own response to other people's body language. I've been in situations where people are asking me questions with their words and their body language is, hey, I can't wait to get out of here. And I have to pay attention to that and just my own kind of reaction to that. I think doing that does help us prepare. And then, again, practicing and being able to say those things comfortably to people, it's important, and I think on the other side of it is really paying attention to then the other person's nonverbal. So, part of adjusting ourself is to also have awareness of how the other person's reacting.
And I think if we can read that and bring that to light in some ways, right, then that can feel so helpful. Just this week, something akin to this happened where, as I was going to sit down with a client I was seeing, my thumb caught my shirt button as I was going, and it popped the button down, and it happened right as I was sitting, and we started kind of getting into things. And I didn't want to necessarily stop and kind of derail things. So I just kind of crossed my arms over that. And for like 20 minutes, I'm sitting here with my arms crossed. And as I said before, I talk with my hands quite a bit. And so I'm not doing this and I'm feeling myself. It's not connecting.
Right.
And we just so happened to be talking about the idea of accepting help and how it felt uncomfortable for him. Right. And, we're really trying to kind of talk about, why is that? And we land on embarrassment. And it felt like a valuable moment to share how, what is the embarrassment doing? It's supposed to be protective, But in that protection, it's limiting him from being able to kind of move freely or being able to do something more efficiently. And I called myself out on it, and, I was embarrassed, and I said, hey, speaking of, and I explained the situation. My button popped, and I'm going to take a moment and fix it. Now I don't have to sit here with my arms crossed the entire time. Right. Now I can connect, and it really connected for him. And so when he's kind of talking about, and, he's uncomfortable talking about help, he's uncomfortable talking about embarrassment, and I can feel that body. And the moment I called myself out, I felt more relaxed, but I felt him be more relaxed. And so it was just kind of this opportunity, I think, to bridge not only nonverbals and connecting, how that can happen, but also in the calling it out, being able to then say, this is what doing something about it and being able to effectively move on from it looks like.
Right. Yeah. Which becomes an intervention, in some ways, in my week, I had maybe a different example with body language, and I had an intake that I was doing with a lady who was coming in just for, general counseling work, and, went through, did the intake, and we started talking about the plan, and she was agreeable to most things. And so we were talking, I was like, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And she's nodding her head. But as she was nodding her head, I noticed she had her lips almost pursed in a way where I went, maybe she's agreeing, but not agreeing. And I was able to actually use that to call it out. And I just said, I felt like maybe we have a little disconnect. Like, I'm kind of giving you my plan, and, maybe there's parts you agree with and parts you don't. Tell me your thoughts. Like, what are you thinking as we're going through this? And she initially was like, no, it's okay. And I said, well, what about it would you change? Like, what about what I'm saying would you think a different way? What would you like to be different? And then she kind of opened up and was able to say, yeah, like you mentioned every other week that I would come in. I really think initially here, I'd really like to come in every week at first. And we were able to have then a discussion and develop a plan. And then some of the techniques we were talking about, she wanted to maybe modify. I guess my point was, it would have been easy to pay attention to her head nodding and simply walk out. And maybe she would come back and maybe she wouldn't. Or maybe she'd come back and give it a few tries. But I think being able to kind of notice and being kind of aware of her, I was able to stop and go, hey, let's visit this for a second. And she might as very well said, oh, no, everything's great. And, I'm okay with all of this. But it gave me the opportunity. So I think, paying attention to not only ourselves, but what our clients, our patients are doing, might help us have some insight in the direction we're taking.
We end up being a bit more like the FBI agent and doing more of our own investigating in terms of explorative in that sense.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I even think back, we started talking about the personal stuff. I remember when, my youngest daughter was young. She's 4 or 5. And I would ask her if she did something and she would say no and shake her head yes. And I would go, oh, wait a second. So even in that kind of simple thing, as a parent, you kind of go, oh, it's kind of funny. It's cute. But that same investigation, I think, happens in therapy. I mean, I think, even, I'm attuned to where people are looking, like, are they making eye contact? Or are they not? Of course, we all think nodding our head, that can mean a positive thing. But yeah, I mean, I think paying attention to all of it is important. I think it helps us therapeutically. It helps us with connection. Interesting with the example I gave with the lady I saw this week. I do believe that my awareness made us have a better connection. She was heard not by words, but by nonverbals. And, and at the end of the day, we have a better plan because of it. And so, yeah, we have to be an investigator. I guess maybe we are a little bit of FBI agents. That's probably true.
You can tap into that.
That's right.
And I think that's something helpful, whether you are a mental health professional or whether you're part of our audience who just enjoys listening about mental health. Being able to really try to focus on how important nonverbals and paraverbals are in communication, because, whether it's the Words Matter episode, the Swear Words Matter episode, or this episode, what we're really talking about is how to make sure the communication that, that we're using is connective, and it is, we're using it with intention, and we're trying to form these bonds that allow us to impart some positive progress, or making sure that we're able to connect and have a shared understanding. All of these things are aligning to allow for that connection that you're talking about, Ray. And so one of I guess maybe the interventions that I'm hearing that could be used is ensuring that we have a recognition of what's the intention behind what we're communicating. What's the message we're trying to convey, and how transparent is that to make sure that it's going to be interpreted in that way? Me crossing my arms with that individual could give a variety of intentions there. And I don't know that he would have landed on it being kind of like for saving face or a bit of like self-preservation. Right. And it could have been standoffish. It could have been, that I wasn't interested or I was less engaged. And so how important it was then to recognize that and challenge that. So that way we had that shared understanding. What are your thoughts, Ray?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we're talking about it as far as communication, but you're right. I think the intervention piece is so important. And I think there's maybe multiple ways. I mean, I think there's one piece of giving people their own self-awareness about their body language is important. And I think that can happen in individual therapy, of course. But, although I am not a couples therapist, and I'm not for a reason, I don't think it's my strength. When I've in the past had to do couples therapy, body language in couples therapy was important. We'd be talking about things, and they're on opposite ends of the couch, and they're saying, yes, I'm going to do it, but they're not making eye contact. And, so that became a great point in doing that work to call that out and say, yeah, I hear you saying yes, but I'm getting the sense that this isn't something you're willing to do. So making that part of, I think, the intervention there. I think the other intervention, is just around this idea of helping people use body language to be more assertive. And I think that doesn't matter if maybe somebody has a confidence issue, or they're depressed, or they're anxious. Helping them understand that their body language may make them assertive, or maybe sometimes they want to be passive, whatever that might be. I think we can use that as an intervention. Yeah, I'd shared earlier about the, there's a great book if people are interested in this topic. Amy Cuddy, who wrote a book called Presence. She also has some TED Talks that are out there. But in her book, she talks about the haka, which is this kind of dance and kind of a dance that's done in New Zealand with a rugby team called the All Blacks. YouTube it. There's a ton of YouTube videos. But it's interesting because it's kind of the way they motivate. And in some ways, it's maybe a form of intimidation to their opponents. But it's very entertaining to watch. And I had a patient who we're working on assertiveness. We're trying to get him to be more comfortable. And so he's into sports. So I said, yeah, have you ever heard of the All Blacks? They're this great, New Zealand rugby team. And they do this dance, and gave him the whole story and said, why don't you watch that for homework? Go and check it out. And there's a whole bunch of different versions. And when you come back, let's talk about what your haka is. What do you do to prepare yourself body language wise before you go into a situation that you're uncomfortable with? And in his case, it's more work conflict. So we put together some things where he, stands a certain way or positions his body a certain way, almost to try to give himself this adrenaline rush to feel more comfortable going in. And it was really positive for him. It was a really positive kind of intervention. So I think we can use it in that way as well, that we can help motivate people, maybe build their confidence, and help with assertiveness by itself. And on another note, if you look at Amy Cuddy's work I mentioned, the other thing that, she talks about the Wonder Woman pose, which is also, I think interesting. Those of you that ever saw the I guess, the 80s version of Wonder Woman with Linda Carter standing with her legs shoulder width apart and her hands on her hip. That being a power stance almost, and talking about the effects of that. So I think we can use body language in that way as well.
And I think one of the other important ways that we can use it, as professionals, whether it's talking to other professionals or trying to impart something positive to those that we serve, is how important body language and tone of voice or paraverbals can be in developing empathy.
Oh, yeah.
And ensuring that it's that we are on the same page and we can be connective, or we can use that to help to move a transition. And, to make a great callback from Michael Alsey, when he was talking about, being a conductor and, I'm hearing the sadness. So let me hear some of that healthy anger. And if we can convey that through body language of like, hey, I'm, the compassionate and the supportive and empathetic towards that sadness. And then being able to feel like that transition, maybe it's a change in our posture and be like, what are you going to do about it? Right. Or what do you have to say about this? And it's, we can kind of give that nudge to allow for a broadening there. So I think it can be an effective tool, but also a very connective tool there. And if it's one that we can put more intention into, it allows for that connection.
I mean, so how interesting is like this idea of body language as an intervention goes from the range of teaching empathy and helping with empathy to building assertiveness, and maybe even in some types milder aggressive type, dealing with anger or something. It really, something that's natural to us that we all do. We all have our body language, and going back to our word intention, right? We make it intentional for therapeutic purpose. And whether that's therapy or maybe in people's own self-help, that they become aware of it to help their own assertiveness. I love the fact that one intervention tackles such a range.
Yeah,
it's useful.
Always nice when we can have it play double duty or triple duty.
That's right. Yeah, it's good. I mean, I think I'd add to that. The other area I think clinically is for those that I think work with individuals maybe on the autism spectrum, and how body language and that awareness can also be therapeutic with that population as well. And I know there's a lot of new research that keeps coming out and about that. I think that's it's a whole other area, but again, how broad of a range that we can work with, and even with specific conditions.
And, I absolutely love this topic, and it's something that, I think if we wanted to, we could sit here and trade stories back and forth, right, for the rest of the day about just the positives and about the ups and downs that we've had personally or professionally with body language and paraverbals. But Ray, I can tell from your body language that it's probably a good thing if we start wrapping up. So with that, we hope you enjoy this episode. Be well and stay psyched.